let's open up the floor. So we're going to take a few questions at a time, and then Brett can choose which ones he answers and which ones he ignores. And we're going to prioritise questions first. We can take some comments later if we have time. So please limit your answer to a question. If you need to make a comment before your question, you have 30 seconds, and then we will applaud you. Okay? Yeah, questions first. So, we've got 3, 4, 5. We're going to, our organisers in the front, we're going to leave them till later because they are always here. And we might have some newbies down the back. Sarah, sitting at the stool, with that nice beard.
You mentioned China a couple times, and in the last 3 years, the focus on renewables has definitely been very different. How do you figure they factor into this?
Sorry, I mentioned who a couple of times?
China.
Okay.
Yep.
First question. Yep.
So I was just wondering about the relationship between water wheels and coal. So you mentioned that water wheels were less profitable, but so I'm just wondering how something could be more expensive but more profitable.
Yep.
That's a great question.
And one more there. Yep.
Do you kind of see more innovation and technology changing that kind of dynamic between profit, or do you think we've kind of reached a plateau in terms of how much it can change?
Great questions. So, 3 questions. I've got to stay sharp. First question, China, the role of China. Where do you see that? Second question, water wheels versus coal. Or was that the third question? And coal and profitability. And third question, could innovation increase profitability? Is that effectively the question? Yeah. Harold, let's go.
I'll take them in reverse order. So the third question, I mean, I don't know, because it's kind of an unknowable, right? I mean, sure, you could get innovation maybe hydrogen will come along and displace everything else. Maybe we'll get fission occurring much sooner than we expect. I mean, and maybe carbon capture will come along on a much more significant scale and viable scale than people currently are expecting. All of those things are possible. I guess my position would be that which people like Kevin, I don't know if you know the climate scientist Kevin Anderson, he's great. His argument is like, we're better off just focusing on what we know works and what we know we can do at scale, rather than kind of hoping for a silver bullet to come along that might not ever come. And I think he and many others are right to warn about, because it becomes kind of an excuse for inaction in the present. If you think that something else like geoengineering or whatever else it might be is going to come along in the future and provide that saving grace. And what's become clear is that if you look at the IPCC projections, with every new round of projections that they produce, their kind of 1.5 degree paths rely more and more every time on technologies that we don't yet have. And I think that's a very dangerous position to rely on when we already have technologies that we know work. So that's just one set of thoughts in relation to that. The point about price and profit is a really good one, and I want to answer it not in relation to water wheels versus coal, but the question of renewables. So, and I'll rephrase the question, which is to say, well, surely if renewables are cheaper than gas and coal-based electricity, then they must be more profitable, right? It stands to reason if your costs are lower, then your profits are greater. On the face of things, that's true, but there are many reasons why that in reality doesn't work. So, and I'll just point to 2 of them. So the first is that yes, generating costs can be cheaper for renewables, but that doesn't mean that they're the only relevant costs. So one of the really important issues with renewables is, and I would say this because I'm a geographer, but it's true, is the geography of renewables. So you can look at pretty much any country in the world, and I don't know the details about New Zealand, but this is true in India, it's true in China, it's true in the UK, it's true in Germany, it's true in the US, is that renewables are predominantly located where people don't live. So they are located in parts of the country or parts of the region where land is cheap, and for obvious reasons, because land is one of the most significant costs. If you're building a wind or solar farm, you need lots of land, and you're not going to build them in places where there are lots of people. But where the lots of people are is where you need the electricity. So there's huge amounts of costs involved in transporting, in transmission and distribution of electricity from where renewables are to where the centres of population are, and none of those analyses that talk about renewables to be cheaper. They talk about that's purely the generating cost, and there's all sorts of other costs, not least related to transmission and distribution, that don't get factored into those. So that's one. But much more important than that is that saying even if all the costs are exactly the same, and even if you have even if you were to have a gas-fired plant on the one hand and a wind farm on the other, that generated exactly the same amount of power over exactly the same period, over say the course of a week or a month or a year, the potential for those two different facilities to generate revenue could be completely different because of the different production profiles of when they generate electricity. So, as I said earlier, electricity prices are massively volatile, and perhaps not surprisingly, what tends to be the case is that wind and solar farms generate electricity at times when electricity is cheapest. In fact, electricity is cheapest because wind and solar are producing them. And so two different plants of two different types can have exactly the same costs, but their revenue potential is completely different from one another, even if they're generating exactly the same amounts of electricity. So there's simply no direct relationship between costs, still less just generating costs, but even all-in costs on the one hand and profitability on the other. Partly because of the different revenue potential, but there's also all sorts of other factors that are relevant there. China and India are the key, right? I know sometimes this argument gets warped, but the reality is that the future of the planet is in one way this is consoling, but you could argue that on the other hand it's worrying, is not going to be decided in Europe, and it's not going to be decided in North America. What North America and Europe do on climate is clearly important, and we shouldn't diminish that, but it's not nearly as important as what happens in China and India. For two main reasons. Three reasons. One is that the populations are vastly greater. The second is that China and India right now are still vastly more reliant on fossil fuels for energy generation than Europe and North America are. And third is that the rate of increase in demand of energy in those countries is going to vastly outweigh what it is in North America or Europe. In many parts of Europe, energy demand is pretty flat. Even declining. In Sweden, it's been declining for a few years now, for example. So the future of the planet is and again, as I say, you could either think of this as consoling or worrying, is not going to be decided in North America and Europe. It's going to be decided principally elsewhere in the world. And so China, right now, about 60 to 65% of electricity is generated through the burning of coal. Renewables are somewhere about 10 or 11%, I think now, which has grown very, very quickly. Renewables are huge in China, and as I said earlier, much of the progress that has been made on the technology front in terms of driving down the cost of the technologies, it's been almost overwhelmingly in China that's occurred, which has been benefiting not just China but the world. And so China is this kind of perverse, kind of contradictory entity, which is kind of terrible because fossil fuels are still so dominant there, but it's also by far the biggest, in absolute terms, it's by far the biggest generator of renewable power in the world. And I think over the last 5 years, around 50% of all newly added renewable generating capacity globally has been in China. And I think that's going to continue in China. I think that you know, and this goes back to the question of state versus capital, but a centralised kind of arguably despotic state, a dictatorial state, can do things on a scale and at a pace that capital can't and won't do because it's fragmented and it's dispersed. And so if the Chinese government decides that it wants to do something, it can do that on a scale and at a pace that, say, the US government or the New Zealand government simply can't do because of its reliance on capital to do those things. So right now, China is building these enormous renewable energy bases out in the Gobi Desert. You know, and each one of those is like equal to the total renewable capacity ever in Sweden, and it's building like 10 of them a year. So that's completely state projects with state-owned finance, state-owned companies doing it. So China is like a really interesting, I mean, it's a really fascinating case, but it's, as you would imagine, it's a really complex case. The way in which electricity is sold in different provinces in China is different, and I've been trying to get my head around all this, and India is obviously another entity altogether. So, yeah, I mean, China is at the heart of that. I don't know whether I answered the question, but that's the best I can do.
Okay, good questions. Next round. Are there any hands? There's one hand at the back and then 2, 3. Is your question being asked now? No, you're going to wait till then.
No, I can ask. Yeah.
Well, next time. So I saw 3 more questions. One at the back here. Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering about, like you talked about how the price is variable. I remember when the spot price was introduced here, probably about 25 years ago, and at that point I think all the electricity generators were still state-owned, but they divided them into competing companies that were state-owned but competed, and now they've been semi-privatised. But is that sort of spot price thing quite universal? It's like there's still a bit of propaganda about Scandinavia being social democratic and what have you. Do they have that kind of setup?
Yeah, good question.
Number 2.
Gas and coal are ownable, storable, and exportable. Do you see renewables being able to compete with those factors, or is energy going to become more localised?
Number 3. Yep.
Bounces off that really well. I wanted to come back to one of the really early things you mentioned about Andreas Malm, and I get to give a bit of a heads up about this in the break, so I know that you know what I'm going to ask. But basically, Andreas Malm makes this really interesting argument about water-based energy generation and move to fossil fuels, and it's not just about the price points, but also about the question of power and who has power, and the ways that you know, if you're reliant on the flow of a river, then there you have a geographical location which can be easily contested with relatively small numbers of, you know, people who are fed up with something, you know. So the question of, you know, I think, as I said to you, you know, you've given us this very, very good analysis of like the way capital invests and why it does certain things. The other part of that is people being involved in the process of production when it comes to power. And as the person next to me just mentioned, you know, fossil fuels, while they were a consolidation of power in a way that moved away from this regionally, extremely reliant on regional production.
What's the question, Tom? I'm getting there.
So you're extremely
2 seconds.
You're so reliant on regional production, it moves away, it moves to coal power, to make coal power plants which you can put anywhere, so you can put wherever labour is cheapest, right? And now you've got a system of renewable energy that's reliant on stuff that is so complex in how it's produced that no individual and no small group of communities can possibly own it and stuff. Does that not then consolidate power in these very, very large institutions that might be extremely difficult to challenge?
Yeah. Brought us a drink earlier, so we give them so, questions. Spot pricing. And a little nugget in there, state-owned versus state-owned enterprise competition versus partially or fully privatised competition. Role of storage and transport and competition between fossil fuels and renewables, and what about the workers, what about communities?
Yeah. Again, great question. So, the first question is a question about how electricity is sold, for the most part, and the answer to your question is no, it's not generalised. So spot markets are basically those are markets where electricity is sold on a, it's not on an immediate basis, but basically what happens is that a day, I mean, it's quite interesting actually, for if you're a nerd like me anyway, but basically what happens is that a day is split up into 48 half-hour chunks, and the day before, different electricity generators bid into the market and they say, we think for that half-hour chunk that we'll be able to produce this amount of power, and we can think we can supply at this price. And so all the generators bid into the market, and then there's the network operator, which basically has to balance supply and demand at all times. So that's one of the things about electricity, right? The electricity in the grid has to be balanced at all times, or else you get blackouts and the system blows up. And so the way it works is that so they bid a day in advance, and then obviously one of the problems with that is that particularly if you're a renewables generator, you actually can't predict with great certainty how much you're going to be able to produce. You can predict pretty closely these days, but not perfectly. So there's always an imbalance, and there's actually another market called the balancing market, which is a real-time market, which allows for adjustments of those day-ahead bids, so that supply and demand do always match at all times. But anyway, that's what the spot market is, and as I said, it's incredibly volatile. The pricing is unbelievably volatile for all sorts of really interesting reasons. But the point is that that's not the way electricity is sold around the world. That tends to be a dominant feature of how electricity is traded in what are liberalised electricity markets, of which New Zealand is a foremost example. You won't be surprised to hear, given that it's a foremost example of liberalised markets in most areas of life. And Europe is probably kind of the home of electricity spot markets. Pretty much everywhere in Europe buys and sells electricity that way. The US is a great example. About 2/3 of the US use a spot market because it's been liberalised, but there's about 1/3 of the US, by population at least, where electricity has not been deregulated at all, and you still have vertically integrated utility operators that manage everything in terms of generation, transmission, distribution and retail, who run the whole caboodle. So there's no spot markets there because there's no different actors, it's just one company that does everything, and they're heavily regulated and prices are set by public utility commissioners. So the US is a bit of a mix, but then there's other parts of the world where spot markets aren't used at all. So, and India would be a great example. Spot markets have existed in India for electricity for about 15 years, but still only about 10% of electricity that's generated in India is traded through spot markets. Most of it's traded under long-term power purchase agreements between generators and distribution companies. So it varies massively in different parts of the world. But I think what I would argue and have argued is that the trend is towards spot markets. So even a country like China, for example, that's the direction in which it's heading, and China's been trialling electricity spot markets in different regions of the country for many years now, and many other parts of the world. So the European originated in Northern Europe. That kind of European model of spot market pricing that exists in New Zealand is the model to which the world is increasingly gravitating. So that's the first one. On the second one, I mean, it's a really interesting question about the relative kind of transportability of different forms of energy. I mean, I don't have a kind of good comprehensive answer to this, but I think one of the things that was really interesting about the energy crisis that has been occurring over the last couple of years, particularly in Europe, and obviously particularly in the wake of what happened in Ukraine, was that there's been a kind of a new burst of investment in renewable energy. So in countries like Germany, for example, where actually investment in renewables have kind of tailed off for a number of years. Last year and this year there's been a massive increase. And the main reason for that is it's got nothing to do with price or profitability, it's energy security concerns. I mean, in lots of countries, they've seen what happened in Europe, and they've seen what happens when you become dependent upon a foreign power for energy, for a significant source of energy supply, and they've realised that's actually not a particularly good position to be in. And the thing with renewables, as you say, is that you're not reliant upon imports of fuels in any way, in which you are obviously in the fossil fuel sector. So one of the, I think probably the main reason why for the kind of uplift in renewables investment that's occurred certainly in Europe in the last years has to do precisely with the kind of the localism. So I think we probably will see a greater localisation of energy, particularly if geopolitical tensions remain rife around the world. But having said that, across Europe, Europe has a pan-European-wide electricity market. Electricity is traded European-wide in Europe, and Sweden last year was the biggest net exporter of electricity to neighbouring countries. Because, for example, France's nuclear reactors suffered lots of outages, so France became a net importer of electricity. So it's really bloody complicated at the end of the day, but I think it will be becoming more local. On the Malm question, I'm not really sure I have a good answer to the question as you posited it, but I think that the question of labour is obviously right at the heart of this, and in those countries where I've been, where I know these issues best, like North America and Europe, like North America and Scotland and so on, unions are playing a massively significant role in debating what this means. I mean, one of the elephants, I used this term when you talked to me earlier, one of the elephants in the room when it comes to this is the fact that I think there's a presumption that you shift to a green energy economy and that there'll be jobs there just like there are in a fossil fuel economy. But as I said earlier, it doesn't take much labour to look after a wind or solar farm when it's being built. And I think that's something that activists in the renewable space are often loath to admit for very, very understandable reasons, right? Which is that there isn't much labour. It takes a lot of labour in terms of construction in the first place, but once it's up and running, there's almost no labour involved at all. So those questions are absolutely at the heart of it, and it's no surprise that a lot of in a country like the UK, a lot of the debates are strongest, and a lot of the renewables development is located in precisely where fossil fuels fossil fuel extraction also occurs because of the influence of labour. So it's not like labour is mute in this whole process. It's definitely not, but it definitely doesn't have the power to decide. That's for sure.
Okay. You knew all the answers to all those hard questions. Any more? Got one down here. That seems lucky last. You've got two questions. Oh, online.
There's one online.
Online questions.
Yeah.
What a time to be alive. So we've got two more questions, and then I think we'll wrap it up. It's getting late. It's raining.
And there was one about nucleus, and if no one else asked that question, I
yes.
You want to talk about nucleus?
Yeah, why not?
Yeah.
Okay, so that'll make three.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. We've got.
That was the question online. So Andrew from Andrew from Dunedin asked about the role of nuclear in the transit.
I'll repeat it. Don't worry. I'll repeat the question. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And my question was around the Labour policy release in the last couple of days. Obviously, on the back of $44 billion announcement for tunnels in the Auckland Harbour. You said it was beyond the pale for a lot of governments to announce, say a $2 billion national investment in infrastructure like that. That's hard to sort of reconcile for me as they announce a $44 billion tunnel. Because obviously I would like it to be in public hands if it were.
Okay, so questions are the role of nuclear in all of this from Andrew from Dunedin.
Yes.
Yep. And then the other question was back to the policy, the $2 billion BlackRock Clean Energy Fund. I don't know if that's the official title, but and squaring that up against investments in other areas like, was it 44 billion, some billions tunnel under the Auckland Harbour.
Yeah, just why that needed to be done through an asset management.
One can be public, one
yeah.
is privatised. Maybe why is that the case, or why do you
Okay, so so the question about nuclear is obviously a really interesting and important topic to address. I'll say two things about nuclear. So the first, and again, there's some basic sort of understanding of the kind of systemic-wide generation of electricity. So one of the arguments that is often made, which is completely true, but it's often overplayed, is about the limitations of renewables as sources of electricity, which is a really straightforward point, right? Which is like the wind doesn't always blow unless you're in Wellington, I suppose. I've just noticed that from being there the last couple of days. And the sun doesn't always shine. So lots of critics of renewables say, look, we can't just rely on renewables because they're intermittent, unreliable energy sources, which is true. And no proper analysis of electricity in the energy sector can ignore that. So what engineers say and what kind of informed advocates of renewables say is no. Right now you clearly can't rely on renewables for 100% of your electricity generation. So what you need for now, and I'll come back to that one second, is what they say is, look, in the future we will be in a position where we have much better energy storage technologies than we have today. So in that scenario, when the sun is shining and wind is blowing and you have more power that is being generated than is actually needed at that particular moment in time, you can efficiently and economically and on a necessarily large scale store that electricity for use at a time when it's actually needed, rather than when it's being produced, when it's surplus. But we're nowhere near being in that position at the moment. So until we reach such a time, we may never reach such a time, the argument is, okay, what you would always need until such a time is a source of what is referred to as base load power, which is a source of power that you can kind of always depend upon for when solar and wind fail. So like, if worse comes to the worst, at least you can fall back on that. And the various sources that people typically point to, the two main ones are nuclear, because you can always rely on nuclear, and gas. And what campaigners say is, okay, we might need to retain some gas-fired plants, but they should be equipped with carbon capture technology that means that they're net zero sources of emissions. But renewables advocates would say, okay, let's get rid of gas and just rely on nuclear. And in some countries like maybe Norway and maybe even New Zealand, you can rely on potentially hydro, geothermal, which, you know, in Norway, hydro kind of is a baseload source of power. It's pretty dependable on a significant scale. But in most countries, you can't do that. So let's say we're going to make nuclear our baseload technology. So that's one thing. The other thing I'd say is there are people, and maybe this is what Andrew and Dunedin was hinting at, who say we're too focused on renewables. And actually, we should be, yes, we should do some renewables, but we should do much more nuclear. And actually, the world has been too quick to kind of, I don't know if this is the right expression, but throw the baby out with the bathwater in terms of nuclear. And actually, we shouldn't have. So if you look at the history of nuclear, until about the mid-1980s, from the 1950s, nuclear as a proportion of overall electricity generation was consistently increasing. And then, not surprisingly, when you got to Chernobyl, and then the period thereafter, it tailed off. And now nuclear has been gradually decreasing, and it's come down from about 15 to about 10, just over 10% now of overall global electricity generation. And so what people say is, look, we need a proper rebuilding of nuclear because it's zero carbon emissions, which it is. I actually don't have a particular particular view on that one way or another. I think there are arguments against nuclear, particularly to do with cost and time. I mean, it takes, once you've got all the development permits and everything in place, you can build a wind farm or a solar farm in 12 months or less. It's very, very quick, whereas a nuclear power station will take you 10 years or more. So, and we're kind of in a hurry when it comes to the energy transition. So I think that there are some issues there. But nuclear as base load power, absolutely. But I guess my position on this, and the reason I focus on renewables in my work, is not because I necessarily think that renewables are the sole right answer, but it's because the world has essentially decided they are. The powers that be have essentially decided that nuclear is never going to be more than a relatively marginal part of the answer to the energy transition solution. And I'm not saying they're right or wrong, but that's the decision they've clearly made. And there are outliers like France, which is the obvious one, and Sweden. Actually, about 30% of power in Sweden is from nuclear. But the world, for the most part, has decided that nuclear is not a significant part of the answer. The public relations issues around it are just too sensitive, and that's where we are. So we have to figure out renewables because that's what the world is banking on. The question about 2 billion versus 40 billion, I'm not familiar with the harbour investment, but I would be surprised if that investment is public borrowing. Is it not more of a kind of public-private partnership thing, where it's public, where it might even be publicly owned, but it's privately financed? That would strike me as more likely.
For the new infrastructure, I suppose I liken it to anything that the government would do. I know we don't have like a Ministry of Works anymore, and we're going to have to contract for everything that we do. But I could also make an analogy for having Matthew Horncastle build all our state homes and run them. You know what I mean? It seems like we're creating infrastructure that could be part of a national resources, but we're not. And it seems strange when we can spend such an amount of money on vital infrastructure, transport, etc. But to have something so important as power production, where you could actually make a profit from it as well. To be.
I agree. I agree with you. I agree with you. That comes down to political priorities, right? At the end of the day, my view is that absolutely government should be leading the way on renewables. And the irony is that if you look at, and I know this isn't the particular focus, but if you look at fossil infrastructures of fossil fuels on the one hand, and renewables infrastructures on the other. Fossil fuel infrastructures around the world are massively owned by the state or by state-owned enterprises. Something like 40 to 50% still of fossil fuel assets internationally are owned by the state, directly by state-owned enterprises, whereas it's less than 10% renewables globally. So as we transition from fossil fuels to renewables, we are transitioning to private ownership.
Okay, but we don't have to.
No.
Yeah. Right, I think that's a good place to wrap it up. But you might stick around for a little bit longer. If anyone wants to come out, hang out.
Absolutely.
So, did you want to wrap up at all, or should I wrap up? Yep. Well, thank you so much first to CSS for hosting us. And for doing logistics, etc. And thank you, Floatney. Thank you heaps to Space Academy for having us. Really appreciate it. And especially thank you to Brett for coming all this way to talk to us. I've learned a lot, and I feel very humbled to be here. And let's give all of those parties a round of applause.